Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It's September 21st, 2022, and this is our book talk on the best ever parades in New England, 1788 to 1940, with Jane Nylander. Jane Nylander is President Emerita of Historic New England. She formerly was the director of Strawberry Bank Museum, curator of textiles and ceramics at Old Sturbridge Village, and curator of New Hampshire Historical Society. She served as a trustee of Old Sturbridge Village, Historic Deerfield, New Hampshire Historical, the Decorative Arts Trust, the National Society of Colonial Dames of America in New Hampshire, the Worcester Historical Museum in Massachusetts, and the Costume Society of America. She's written and lectured extensively on New England social history and domestic interiors, textiles, clothing, and antiquarianism. She is the winner of many awards and is widely published in periodicals, including Antiques, Antiques and Fine Arts, and Early American Life. Jane is the author of Our Own Snug Fireside, Images of the New England Home, 1680 to 1860. That's one of my personal favorites. Fabrics for Historic Buildings, and Windows on the Past, 4 Centuries of New England Homes. Jane, thank you so much for joining us and talking with us this evening.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks to Maine Historical Society for inviting me to talk about my book this evening. It's been now less than a year, but it's the result of 16 years of research and deep thinking about a subject that I have found absolutely fascinating. The research was difficult to call a halt and turn my attention to writing. I wanted to thank Old Sturbridge Village and Sarah Bowen of Bowen Publishing for publishing the book. And I certainly want to thank Maine Historical Society and for all its cooperation and help in producing the book. I had assistance, as I did in every state in New England, from collections and research staff, from image coordinator, and it's in Maine from the wonderful resource of Maine Memory. The cover of the book shows one of those long columns of marching men. It isn't really quite a parade. It's a procession honoring, in this case, Daniel Webster on his arrival in Boston in 1851. And it includes no women, it includes no floats, it includes no children, it includes no banners. And it is just the raw skeleton of something I want to talk with you about tonight. Not just the long columns of marching men and the stirring music, but let's think about costumes and banners and pretty girls and children and fabulous floats. We look for early pictures, and the first I can show you of a whole parade is this from Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion of the Railroad Jubilee in Boston in 1851, when they were celebrating the connection of a new railroad linking Boston to Canadian business through rail going to Montreal, and looking to bring Canadian goods to export through the ice-free port of Boston. Parade, like any other, started with a group of men carrying a big wide stick to clear the route so that push the crowd back and make sure there was room for all that was to follow. And then come the first officials, the marshals, and the mounted horsemen, the people honored for having put the parade together. And almost immediately come troops of soldiers, the Boston Light Infantry and the Fusiliers and others. And this is, of course, telescoped, and probably 20 groups of marching men are symbolized by just those few. And then it leads us to the honored guest of the evening, the Canadian representative, to celebrate the opening of the railroad. And then it begins to suddenly tease us with these wonderful floats. And we can come along here to see the great statue of the Wounded Indian, which is now at the Chrysler Museum of Fine Arts. And a full ship with sails furled from a shipyard and some parades had many of those. A frame shop, Barnum's Museum. It moves on past a volcano run in a elaborate float by a fireworks company, the Boston Market at Faneuil Hall with the butchers chopping up a cow in the course of the parade, and continues on along here to a railroad locomotive and other big floats until it resolves at the end with what is usually referred to as citizens generally, which would be men usually marching in various fraternal and business groups. And in this case, it ended with every school child in Boston walking with their teachers in groups at the end of the 3.5-mile-long procession that took hours to pass by. These things were complicated and interesting, and they have repeated year after year in one way or another, and they help to reinforce ideas about the past and to suggest new cultural ideas. But let's get into some of the details. New England's local historical societies and the state ones are rich resources for studying this topic, parades, and Maine's are no exception whatsoever. This delightful image came up in Bangor, showing about 1910 members of the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, who had fought in the Civil War, with their delightful banner, happy to be back together with their fraternity. Yankee boys who served from 1961 to 65 through the horrors of the Civil War. But here, 60 years later, marching within their Grand Army hats and wearing their medals, honoring fallen comrades, and enjoying the fraternity of the occasion as they trudge up the street. Next time they appear in a parade, they were riding in a carriage. But even more interesting to me than these lines of men, of which there are thousands in any big parade and hundreds even in our local parades, are the floats. And I began hunting for things related to parade topics probably 20 years ago, just because I've always found them fascinating. One turned up fairly early in a basket at a group antique shop in Center Ossipee, New Hampshire. And I at first thought it was a New Hampshire shot, but it turns out, thanks to posting it on Facebook and having someone identify it, it shows Greenville, New Hampshire on July 4th, when else but 1898, right in the heart of the Spanish-American War. But when they're celebrating the time when the war had turned, a few months after Dewey's thrilling victory at Manila Bay. This group of boys in what else but sailor suits encourage everyone watching to remember the Maine. As I began to think about parades and the history, I wondered what I could find about the earliest things in New England. And of course, there are many, many newspaper accounts. Just looking for July 4th in any year finds loads of information. But fortunately, I remembered once a visit to the New Haven Colony Historical Society, it was called then, now the New Haven Museum, where this wonderful ship model, I hope you can tell that it's the height of the room, was carried in the procession at New Haven on July 4th in 1788, the year of the adoption of the federal Constitution by this state. So it was the ratification procession of the ship of state, and this float survived. It actually was used in many parades in New Haven over time, and it's been in the museum since the 1880s. They don't let it out anymore, not surprisingly. This was described at the time as a federal ship with all sails flying, manned by a captain and sailors. And the procession was, according to the idea, conceived at Boston at their rejoicing last winter, said the New Haven paper. And that is because Massachusetts became the sixth state to vote in favor of ratification on February 6th, 1788. And remember, Massachusetts included Maine at that time. A small committee of Boston artisans and mechanics had organized a celebratory procession. And I have to ask you to imagine this, for there is no picture. The only time I'll ask you to do that this evening. But stepping off at 11 o'clock on a frosty morning on Friday, February 8th, in 1788, the ground was covered with snow, and 1,500 men walked through Boston streets in occupational groups, identifying themselves with banners and carrying their tools. The march was led by 16 foresters with axes, symbolically clearing the land for the new nation. And then, to underscore the idea that agriculture would be the foundation of a successful society, farming was personified by a man with a plow, followed by sowers strowing seeds, reapers with sickles, mowers with scythes, haymakers with rakes, yokes of fat cattle, and other farming utensils. There were 2 ox-drawn carts with the elements of sustenance and raiment. The first had fresh cuts of beef with 8 master butchers. The other, for raiment, carried flax dressers, preparing linen fibers for spinning. And following them were the 28 groups of different trades, each man carrying trades. And at the end, the symbolic heart of it all was the federal Constitution, another ship, also on runners, drawn, of course, by 13 horses, another representation of the 13 states now united in a common purpose. The kind of romantic and allegorical thinking and representation in this kind of parade goes way back to ancient times. And it's interesting to see how rich it was in our first official procession in 1788. There had been previous parades in Boston, but I choose to start this story here. Other processions, of course, had ships. Just take a look at this. Here in 1844, also in Boston, is a meeting of temperance advocates, the Grand Massachusetts Washingtonians in convention, shown right at the end of the procession, which has just come back to the common with the leaders and the soldiers, as you'd expect. But in the back, there's a lifeboat. There are only 2 floats in this that I can see, lots of banners, but just 2 floats. And these men are cheering the fact that they have successfully forced the city to reduce drinking among sailors and end the practice of issuing grog 2 times a day to sailors. And then closer to the front of the line is the well sweep, and the well signifying the famous poem by Samuel Wadsworth, The Old Oaken Bucket, accompanied by 250 children of the Cold Water Army, who had sworn that they would only ever drink cold, clear water and never involve themselves in drinking alcoholic beverages. The Old Oaken Bucket continued to be a popular parade float, and this wonderful watercolor shows the way it was depicted in the Portland Centennial Parade in 1886. Still the same thing, the tall well sweep and the bucket coming up out of the well with its cold, clear water. Firemen were important in parades, as they still are. And the early view I can find is this in Portland. It's wonderful rare daguerreotype, one of 3 that are treasures of the Maine Historical Societies, which shows 5 separate fire companies on Middle Street, ready to march in procession to a muster in a planned parade. They're all dressed in different parade cost uniforms, each representing a different company. They stand with their polished engines and banners ready to move on. Wonderful picture of a lost scene. And sadly, as you know, all of these buildings were destroyed by fire at various times prior to 1866. Firemen were always proud to show their uniforms and their oldest equipment. Maine memory yields us this wonderful picture in Holton, taken in 1925 when they had polished up their old steam pumper purchased in 1872 and added it to a parade. And in the upper right is a float built on top of a parade fire engine shown in Belfast, done by the Phoenix Company early in the 20th century, with a child sitting above the Phoenix in the corner there. Parades honor distinguished people and guests to the city, as here in Portland in 1860, when the Prince of Wales was driven through the city in an open barouche, and cheering crowds and ladies throwing bouquets in his lap. Or here in Bangor in 1871, when U.S. Grant had to celebrate the connection of a railroad with a Canadian terminal and to greet Lord Lismore, the Governor General of Canada, who had come. That parade included 15 fire companies and various militia groups and 750 lumbermen of mills owned by Bangor men. In front of the Bangor House, a special arch had been erected saying, "Our president, we make them welcome you." And there stands Grant in his chariot ready to be drawn through the city. Civic decoration like that arch was an important part of this. Combined with flags, it embellished all the sites of parades. On this occasion in Bangor, there were 5 additional arches at other intersections of the city. Grant came back to Maine in just a year later as he was running again for re-election, running again for president. And on September 16th, this delightful picture shows us Grant arriving at the Augusta Depot. You're probably familiar with it from the wonderful exhibit and publications that have been held of celebrating the John Martin watercolor acquisitions by the Maine Historical Society. This was part of Grant's campaign. It was celebrated by, as you can see, reception with lots of soldiers, illustrations showing things happening over time and from various angles, perhaps hard to understand, but you can get this enthusiasm of the fireworks showing over the houses, the concern for this one house called a Democrat house with no festivities, no lights in the windows, no illumination, and the fireworks only coming from the neighbors. And yet another arch saying Grant and 3 cheers for Grant and Wilson here. Soldiers in these things were usually part of the militia. America's Militia Act of 1791 and 2 required all free and able-bodied male citizens of ages 14 to 45 to be enrolled in the militia company, and they had to drill and practice at least twice a year. Many upper and middle class men chose to enroll in elite volunteer companies and elect their own officers and purchase their own distinctive and expensive uniforms and enjoyed the marching and the drilling and lots of social activities and higher status. The enrolled companies of middle class and lower class men simply put up with it and went through the act of showing up for training day twice a year. But as time went by and the militia had never been called to active duty, things became a little restless. And a new tradition began to develop as the militia training days disintegrated into drunken and disorderly chaos, starting in the late 1830s and early 40s. In many cities and small towns throughout New England, groups of men and boys begin to appear as early as 5 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of July and determined to have a great time, making as much noise as possible and parading the city dressed in antique military uniforms or scraps of old clothing, carrying, not real ammunition, but broomsticks, liquor bottles, someone carrying a scythe with a long spool on it, but drums and an unhappy leader trying to keep track of them all. They called themselves the Horribles, or the Fantastics, or the odds and ends. Eventually, the word settled down, and they're most often referred to as the Horribles, and they continue in many places to this day. Now, they're characterized by outrageous humor, gross exaggeration, gender and racial stereotypes. They marched alone or in groups. Sometimes they had skeletal horses. Sometimes they had skits. Sometimes they had absolute tableaus on floats. A large and big example is this one. In this case, where the huge turnout in a big city. At 5 a.m., this group marched forth. And imagine them assembling in the early hours before that. And their reliance on people knowing that they'd show up because a very big crowd was on hand to watch. These were the celebrations, the first events of the centennial, celebrated in New England, of course, in 1875, a full year before the national centennial. This was in Boston and Charlestown on Bunker Hill Day. And the arrangement of these people interests me. In this tumbrel, sort of like Marie Antoinette was carried to the guillotine, as a group of large men in female costume, all of them masked, none of them in blackface, but all dressed as women. Then comes a military group. This guy is holding the sword of Bunker Hill, which is, of course, an exaggerated, huge, long thing. And then comes a musical group dressed, again, men in wigs and masks, in aesthetic dress with striped stockings and pointy-toed shoes, like Patience in the Gilbert and Sullivan musical. And then comes a wagon titled Good Hull Free Lovers, representing the candidacy of Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president in 1872 on the platform of the Equal Rights Party. And her priorities were pacifism, free love, women's rights, including suffrage. Needless to say, she was not elected. And then behind her come typical characters in Horribles parades. You could rent these costumes or make them yourself, but there was always a devil and a skeleton and a large number of musical instruments making more noise than music. Individual towns memorialize their horrible parades as well. And here also on July 4th of 1875, in this case at Bryant Pond, you see a small arrangement of miscellaneous characterizations. People, a great straw-stuffed female giant, and a wagon with wheels of different size, so it wobbles as it moves along, and a couple dressed in a wagon with all their worldly goods and a sign saying, "Bound for the Black Hills," where a gold rush was underway, and they were off to go. And in Sanford, Maine, by 1900, a group had built this improved houseboat, and insisted they were about to use this as their El Dorado and leave. But again, it's a group of men cross-dressed in masks, enjoying something they thought was funny and locally understood at the time. Some of these things lost their whole point and can only be described as truly horrible. This great wagon load of tin cans and all kinds of junk with a man in it and a man riding sidewise on the horse, even the horse with a hat on, both men masked. But I can make no sense out of it. It's simply truly horrible. And it must have been familiar enough that these two women were really more interested in talking to each other than watching the men making fools of themselves as horrible on the 4th of July. Some other ideas are seen through the whole history of parades, and I'm really interested in how they change over time, how we portray various key figures and symbols in our country. Here's are two different depictions of liberty, nearly 200 years apart. On the right in 1800, excuse me, the goddess of liberty is offering sustenance to the American eagle. This is a silk embroidery. She in a very classical robe. Has nothing to do with these two people who appeared in New Haven on St. Patrick's Day in 2013. Obviously inspired by the Statue of Liberty with her radiant headdress, something that was not seen, of course, until after the statue was installed in New York Harbor in 1886. So liberty is one way before 1886 and then quickly turns to this sort of thing, which we see now quite frequently. America is seen in other ways. And in this absolutely scrumptious float on July 4th in Augusta in 1865, this concoction is titled Our Country, Its Arts and Its Arms. And it personifies national greatness, arts, and power. Way at the top is an American eagle. I assume it's a specimen of taxidermy. I can't suggest anything else. And then comes America as an Indian princess who had started off riding way up high and clearly has come down a little bit just because it's so tippy. And then there have a circle of young women in white representing the Army, the Navy, agriculture, commerce, and the laws, the things considered most important for our national greatness and power. And then a circle of young women in white, all with crowns of flowers and with ribbons across their front, diagonally placed, each with the name of one of 36 states, including the newest, Nevada, which had joined the country during the Civil War. It's important and interesting that it's all 36 states in 1865. They've included the 11 states that had succeeded as part of the Confederacy. And now in 1865, to symbolize the unification of the country after the horrors of the Civil War, the girls have linked their arms together. As the country grew, of course, the number of states grew as well, and the size of a vehicle needed to convey them in a parade got larger and larger and larger and more difficult. Here in Thomaston in 1887, Liberty in the old traditional gown, stars on her skirt and stripes on her bodice and a flag, no reference whatsoever to the Statue of Liberty, leads this great farm wagon full of states. Again, young women in white with flowers on their heads and some pennants on the side hanging over with the names of 38 states this time, including Colorado, which had joined 11 years before. But as I said, the number gets big and the floats get awkwardly overloaded. And we begin to see a preference for using the 13 colonies instead of this current number of states as we get past 1876. And here in Sanford is a good example of that, with this great tower at the back behind Uncle Sam with 13 colonies. Women in the same arrangement of white with flowers, each personifying one of the colonies. And then in some ways horrifyingly, on the grooms riding on the horses and pulling them are all in blackface. And the researchers at Stanford who found and supplied this for me said this was the first time that they had discovered anything shown this way in their large archive of Stanford photographs. And yet we do find often that blackfaces or actually employed black men were hired to serve as grooms or horseback riders for parade floats in the 19th century, sometimes in white clothes like these suits, and sometimes in Turkish dress with turbans, suggesting Orientalism. Now, there are really two legs, perhaps, of parades after 1850 or 60 that are relatively concrete and consistent that I'd like to turn to. And here, an 1851 parade in Danvers, Massachusetts, shows those. At the top, it suggests history. 1851, of course, was the 75th anniversary of the United States, celebrated as the nation's Jubilee. And Danvers was celebrating its own centennial that year. And here are Governor Endicott's descendants and other members of the community wearing 18th century clothing, suggesting early times and the origins of their town. And the other side of significance to these communities is, of course, industry and business, not unlike the presence of the tradesmen in the ratification procession. And here in the illustration is a shoe shop with the line, "Industry will prosper," and shoes hanging outside, the kind of little 10-footer which was scattered through New England as a shoemaking shop and ultimately became the primary business of Danvers. So let's explore these two themes just for a moment. History begins to be shown in tableau floats, like the shoe shop, or in this case, like the landing of Columbus. And the presentations of history are often made in cloth. So they begin, not surprisingly, with the landing of Columbus. This is a drawing by a bookseller in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, named James Head, who's left us with 60 drawings of period of 19th century floats from his own time. And some of them are so fantastic they never were used. But this one I know from a newspaper description appeared in a Portsmouth parade in 1852. That is to say, 40 years before Benjamin Harrison declared Columbus Day to be on October 12, 1892, the official date. And beginning in here, Head doesn't show us much about the costume of these people, only a flag supposed to be that of Spain and a row of sailors who are apparently grateful to find land and are in whatever he dreamed up their costume must have been. In the 1892 parade, Columbus Day was already stirring some concern. Many towns had parades with gaudy ships with men in Renaissance costume illustrating Columbus landing in America, often presented by Italian or Spanish organizations, sometimes both. But here in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1892, Swedish citizens, had presented a Viking ship in the Columbus Day parade, essentially announcing we were here first, which is this bit of controversy that has been there about this topic ever since. I was unable to find if something like this had happened in New Sweden. Of course, it may well have. In the Portland, Maine centennial, the Maine centennial in Portland in 1920, the discoverers included Columbus, but float 3 was the Cabots, the dawn of discovery, Cabots on the coast of Maine, again in some sort of elaborate Renaissance costume. In this case, designed and provided by a professional New York float maker, the Mesmer and Damon Company. who were manufacturers of amusement park rides and laugh in the dark and funhouse extravaganzas, as well as parade floats, and had been contracted by the city and paid by the city to do 20 primary floats for the Maine Centennial Parade in 1920 at Portland. Every town's in chronology tried to portray what it thought were the unique aspects of its history and stand out from others. And a good example of that attitude is this one in Brunswick, where the parade float says only one woman in Brunswick was ever placed in the stocks. It doesn't tell you her name or what her crime may have been. And although that may have been well known in Brunswick at the time, the parades like this attracted huge crowds from out of town, and it may have been something of a mystery to at least half of the audience at the time. Early chronologies often include log cabins as the homes of early settlers, and in the Portland Parade in 1886, we see a float for the first families, Cleves and Tucker families, building, the men of that families building the first log house. Interesting thing is, irony really, is that this was not necessarily the kind of architecture that was actually used in the first log houses, but this float was designed by the great Portland architect John Calvin Stevens, who seemed to have fallen for the log cabin myth, and the float was constructed according to that. Deep in the primeval forests, says the text in the printed account of the parade. Where else, and what else in the land of Longfellow? The Gorham Grange picked up the same idea of leading off their parade of sequences of various historical events in the life of Gorham with a log cabin as the first float, in this case pulled by horses, and with people, women and children, in costume inside. Using the symbolic of resourceful men who used materials at hand to create a safe foundation for family life in the New World, a myth that was repeated often and believed in for a very long time. Of course, the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence are often seen as floats, but also other things suggesting the spirit of the revolutionary times. And it seems to me this group of fife and drummers ahead of revolutionary soldiers in Skowhegan in 1947 is inspired by Archibald Willard's 1876 painting, is a good example of these groups that costumed themselves to reflect the essence of patriotic spirit. History themes also include tableau floats of the domestic life, and we begin finally to see women involved. At the Eliot Centennial Celebration in 1910, this group of women sat before a little cardboard painted fireplace and exhibited their familiarity, or maybe their unfamiliarity, with textile making tools, a large spinning wheel, a clock reel, and examples of other domestic life. Reflecting the ideal of domesticity, the dutiful woman and the productive domestic manufacturers that were characteristic of the good old days. Other popular ideas compared then and now. At Lynn, Massachusetts, for example, in 1930, we have another pair of cardboard fireplaces, but comparing Lynn in the 18th century on the right with a built wooden fireplace and a woman seated at a loom in 18th century style dress with two children, compared with the modern scene of 1930, sponsored by General Electric, a big employer in Lynn to this day, This float shows an electric range, an electric upright sweeper, and a coal fireplace with flowers and other decorations on the mantelpiece. And the lady sits there next to an electric toaster, reading, in a clean white dress with no hint that she's engaged in any hard physical labor whatsoever, and perhaps even suggesting that she's doing something as radical in 1930 as using birth control, for she has no children tugging at her skirts. Other celebrations of progress are more public. Benefits, shall we say. Automobiles, certainly, but in this case, in Biddeford, an illustration of the benefits of having new electricity provided by the York County Power Company. I confess it's a double exposure, but it rather underscores the appearance of the lights of the tall telephone poles, electric poles, the wires that string through our communities so terribly to this day, and the blessing of street lights and clean cooking electric stove, which allows this group of ladies to wear white dresses and not be soiled with chimney and soot. The other primary parade theme, familiar to you, certainly the Maine Historical Society, is that of industry and business. The banners of the early 19th century, which are inscribed in the Ratification procession, a great collection of them survived and saved by the consortium museums when they were offered at auction a few years ago. And here are just 5 examples of the 17 from the Maine Charitable Mechanics Organization that were painted in 1841. Some of them celebrating their own skills and the benefit of those skills in the community, and others picking up the contemporary themes of temperance. The banner here on the ship says temperance, which we've talked about earlier. These honor hand skills and the early trade groups, and they've been derived from early groups that were found in England and on the continent, even in medieval times. But after the Industrial Revolution really grabbed hold, and after the Civil War, the trade sections of parades changed and began not just so much celebrating or illustrating the skills and the tools, but illustrating the products of men and machines. A good example is this entry by the cabinet making firm of Walter Corey, which was celebrating 50 years of business when they put this float in the 1880 Portland procession. They had, after all, the Corey Company, like many businesses at the time, a large number of delivery wagons and wagons that were used for gathering supplies. And Corey owned 13, and he asked his men to pile their goods on them and dress in business suits, not their work clothes. And they all were entered. All 13 teams were entered in the parade. And this is typical, the kind of thing that began to be seen again and again and again. In Brunswick, we have Wilson's Pharmacy, another old local business with this huge mortar and pestle, the ancient emblem of apothecaries and drugstores, but dressed up with information that indicates that one could buy not only drugs and medicines, but perfume and fancy toilet articles, which I'm sure meant that they were packaged in elaborate and possibly even scented paper packaging, something new indeed. And on the left, a paint frame shop indicating their skills and products as well. And big industry built specific floats for these parades as well. The Portland Company, another old business, 40 years old. It's in 1886 in the Portland Parade, one of the long line of businesses built this float with whistles and examples of their wheels and gears and painting on on both sides, indicating that they built steam vessels and locomotives as well. The result of these things is that these were very long processions, in some cases even described as interminable. And people did get bored watching yet another business promote itself. Committees realized that it was less expensive to invite businesses to participate in a parade of this sort, and they all wanted to be part of it. And so the committee was completely relieved of this time necessary to solicit people to become part of the parade and of the expense of building floats and providing and commissioning floats like those we saw, the 20 by Mesmore and Damon or the one by John Kelvin Stevens. The businesses took care of it and took a lot of the expense and time away from the business communities. But there are contrasting things as well. The Casco Bay Steamboat Company built this exotic version of Cleopatra's barge for display locally, but as you see it here, it had been sent by railroad up to North Conway, New Hampshire. Here seen at Intervale in front of Moat Mountain, just above the Saco River. Men and women under the canopy, all dressed in white. In this case, a contrast to the tradition of having black drivers. But an exotic piece, attention getting and calling attention to the Casco Bay Steamboat Company. I assume trying to encourage vacationers in North Conway to take a train ride down to Portland, just less than 60 miles away, and have a cool ride on the steamboat in the heat of the summer. The ads, as we saw with streetlights, the parades also celebrate innovation and commerce. Sorry, I missed one. In Holton, for example, a clothing shop, Green's, which was in business until fairly recent times, within living memory for many of us, members of their staff built this example of an airplane, and one man walked inside it and another steadied on the side. They're not an aviator costume, but they obviously had a grand time inventing it and then presenting something that new and unusual on July 4th in 1914. And back to 1920 and the productions of Mesmore and Damon, the commercial boat builders. It's one of their most interesting and perhaps unusual floats was this designed to celebrate the arrival of the automobile and the necessity for modern highways. So they built a hill, which you can see on the float itself going up here, and the car, which was supposed to ride up to the top. Here seen in front of the Morse Livy House Victorian Mansion. But it's intriguing to me. It's ironic, certainly, that this thing celebrating automobiles and modern highways was still horse-drawn, a powerful tradition in parades. Other new things, what else? Of course, crepe paper, a completely new innovation which transformed some of the aspects of, certainly of costuming and float decoration. It was available by the early 1890s, and it was quickly popular as an inexpensive, colorful, easy to use for costumes, float decorations, and trimming cars and bicycles. The parade is Deering Oaks Doll Carriage Parade with the winners at the front. First place went to this example with Japanese parasol and kimono. Not something we would find often today as we're concerned about cultural appropriation, but perfectly expected in that time. And two other examples of crepe paper trimmed floats. And this little gal, the third winner, her mother had copied a design in a great Denison crepe paper how-to book of how to create a swan, and she had happily won third prize in this parade. Another example I'm showing you is two children riding in Kennebunk in the 1920s. Their basket was made out of a child's express wagon covered with crepe paper and ornamented with flowers. And their costumes too are made out of crepe paper. You can certainly tell her bonnet is, and other aspects as well. In 1916 and 17, as the prospect of war loomed over America, preparedness was a very popular theme. And Kennebunk Boy Scouts on trimmed bicycles created this Red Cross wagon, and one girl dressed as a Red Cross nurse rode along with them. After peace was declared on November 11th, 1918, there were triumphant parades everywhere. Here at Bath, Maine, Columbia rode high on a flag-decked car behind returning soldiers in a grand parade. During the war, women had played a very important role in the Red Cross throughout Maine, and this float in the Portland Centennial had a group of women wearing the various countries that the Red Cross had assisted during the war. And each of the women is holding a ribbon carried up to the Red Cross. And then standing in front is a woman dressed as the primary symbol of the Red Cross at this time, based on the great recruiting poster of the Red Cross as the greatest mother of the world. In the 1920s, children's health was a great concern, and the one way to instill certain lessons of healthful behavior and good living was children's health parades. And here a group in a health parade at Kennebunk in the 1920s shows another group of girls in Red Cross uniforms with their doll carriages. And some of the dolls are also dressed in Red Cross uniforms, even though they are supposed to be patients. And the sign, which I'm afraid may be blocked for some of you, gives the key to their success as nurses. It says, "We are clean." And that was, of course, one of the messages of child health, was that you should bathe and brush your teeth daily. Patriotic symbols are overwhelmingly popular in the early 20th century. And a few examples where I won't dwell long on. But at Bath, the BIW sheet metal workers begin, and a group of sailor boys with their 48 star flag begin to signal the awareness and preparedness of, again, the patriotic themes strengthening in through the 40s. And then after the war, the Cosmopolitan Club in Bath, a women's group, celebrated Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, led by, again, a figure of liberty with her torch held high in the statue. All of these, some clearly stand out as well-designed, have a significant idea, and are easily understood. Some children brought forth traditional things, Uncle Sam and the firemen again, or grabbed what was nearby to decorate a wagon with patriotic symbols and join in. Some places had awarded prizes, although not everywhere, because there was a clear understanding of the risk of hurt feelings, and some committees offered to avoid that. But at Kingfield, Maine, in the late 1940s, this group of children participating in a parade for decorated bicycles and doll carriages lined up in front of the speaker's platform, displaying their creations, and anxiously awaited the announcement of the prize winners. I have no idea who won, but someone certainly will be named the best ever. It was the common theme of any parade. Every parade had some description of what it was. The finest ever held here, a good show, the most beautiful display, an imposing exhibition. But the name I found most often, or the adjective I found most often, applied to New England parades is the best ever. And I hope we can appreciate the diversity of content and how many different things add up to many best evers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That was great. Folks, I'm putting the link in the chat right now to where you can purchase your copy of Jane's book from the Maine Historical Society Museum store. The website is mainhistorystore.com. And of course, you can visit our museum store in person Tuesday through Saturday. We're open from 10 to 5. And folks, if you've got any questions, don't forget to type them into the chat. Jane, what made you want to write this book?
Well, as I said, I began studying this years ago, and it was really much more fun to do the research than to write the book. And after probably 15 years or so, my children said, "You have to write it, Mom. You really have to write it." And I realized that, and I had begun doing occasionally talking about it with historical groups, and people wanted to see more, wanted to know more. So I did begin to write it. And then when COVID shut me down and I couldn't be out doing more research, and I had more than enough material, I decided to go ahead and write it, and happily found publisher. As I said, Sturbridge decided to co-publish it. And Sarah Bowen took the other half and brought it out just last November.
Did you have out of all the different parades that you looked at, was there one that you might describe as a favorite, or one that you found like the most interesting?
Well, my favorite has to be Freedom, New Hampshire's Old Home Day Parade, because I've watched that one almost every year of my life since I was 10, which is a very long time.
Do they still have that? Do they still
have it? Yes, yes. Old Home Day and Old Home Week in Freedom, not just one day, but a whole week, parade's always the first Saturday of August. And it continues, and of course, it's been instructive to me and interesting to me to watch how the same idea changes year after year after year. The kindergarten does one thing, the Friends of the Library do another. They show them. For a long time, there were well-groomed saddle horses. There were always the 4-H kids. There always was a pair of oxen. Some years there were loads of oxen. Some things rise and some things fall. And it's interesting to see how it changes over time. And because I have always summered in Freedom, it's been instructive to have observed it. And I think that's one of the reasons I got very interested in pursuing this and thinking, what could I find out? And at first I started driving all over New England and having a very interesting time digging into historical collections, and people were wonderfully helpful bringing things out for me. And then the internet began to be extraordinarily helpful, of course, and the amount of material that bloomed in the last 10 years, both pictorially and with digitized newspapers, transformed the research and made it much easier to make comparisons.
For sure. It's interesting, towns like that, like Freedom, that have had a parade as a tradition for such a long time. And certainly there are a lot of towns that still do, but I feel like in general, parades like the ones you describe in the book and that we talked about tonight, you don't see them quite as often as we used to. You kind of stopped the book in the 1940s. Why do you think that is? Like, why the decline in popularity overall?
Well, I'd say two things. The 1940 was not so much the decline, but it was the quality of the photographs. First of all, when the war came in 1940, parades stopped for a while. They did stop for basically, except for a limp effort on the 4th of July. And then afterward, the photography was primarily syndicated news pictures rather than professional photographs of the parades. or it was local snapshots, which became Kodachrome, which have all turned yellow.
Ah,
And it really just changed, and the nature of it changed. And I knew I had so much rich historical material. And after all, I'm a historian. I was really interested in the early stuff. So I decided I'd stick with that and hopefully plant a few seeds so someone else might get out there and pay attention to the later material. But you're right, it has changed. I mean, and I've seen it in Freedom. I've seen it many places that there are fewer people in the parade. More people are riding in a vehicle. Even the bands are riding in a vehicle rather than marching. Some towns people still get out some horse-drawn floats, or they get out old carriages.
sure.
But it doesn't have that. And every now and then there's a great burst of creativity for a specific anniversary, perhaps, and they put some real effort into a number of floats. Some years it's sort of, we have to do something, but we're not going to do much, but it's a lot of work. But I see that cycle even in 19th century parades. A town that I would follow through reading the newspaper for the 4th of July for, say, 20 years, you'd see that they would come to a great climax on an anniversary or in 1876 or a particular date like that. And then the next year there might not be anything, or there might not be very much at all. People get tired of it, and it's a lot of work. And, because it's so much fun and they're so interesting, eventually a younger, newer group comes along and says, oh no, this is too good. We can't let this go, and we'll kick it off and do it again. So let's hope it'll come back to life.
Sure. Someone in the audience is saying they have a marvelous image from MHS of women in costume in Portland parading for women's suffrage. And then this individual asks, what is the difference, would you say, between a parade and a protest?
A protest?
Yeah, like how would you, if you were to put them, say, in like a Venn diagram, what's different about them? What do they have in common? How would you decide, oh, this is a parade and this is a protest?
Well, maybe you could say protesters parade, but parading is an exhibition of an idea or a celebration of an idea. A protest is more a subset of that is
trying to like achieve a particular goal or raise.
I was pulling back a minute because I have a section in the book about advocacy. And there's the temperance stuff is all advocacy. The political stuff is all advocacy. That's not protesting, but it's really aiming at a specific idea. A protest is doing the same thing. It's aiming for a specific idea. In this case, it's against something instead of in favor of something. And it makes use of the same techniques, but the goal is different.
Sure. And your book, it sounds like, is more on the parade aspect, or that
it is. I became most interested in the floats because I think they're really a kind of folk art. It's absolutely ephemeral. The floats mostly go away at the end of the year. Some places keep a certain, the vehicle remains, but the topic and all the way it's created.
Were you able to see like any floats up close in your research, or did you just get photos? You saw some actual floats?
Oh
yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Jane, so much. Again, folks, the book is The Best Ever, and I'm glad you explained too where the title came from, because I was wondering where what inspired that. And you can get it at Maine Historical Society's museum store. And you can learn more about our other upcoming programs and exhibits, how you can visit and become involved on our website, mainehistory.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you again, Jane, for sharing with us your expertise and your time. Is there anything we wanted to say before we close?
Thank you for the invitation. Enjoy the book.
Our pleasure.
A lot more in there.
All right. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
Bye.